It is great to welcome back to the program today Dr. Christopher DiCarlo, who's an award-winning philosopher, educator, and author of the latest book on critical thinking called So You Think You Can Think: Tools for Having Intelligent Conversations and Getting Along. It's great to have you back on.
Good to be here. Always a pleasure.
So a common question I get from viewers when I take live calls is, I have family members who believe this or who believe that, and I want to know how it is that I should confront them. And usually my answer is that depends on how willing you are to ruin the relationship. In other words, there's ways to do this more lightly with a Socratic method of questioning and sort of gentle inquiry into how one formed their beliefs. There's ways to have these conversations much more pointedly and aggressively. Give me your sort of 30,000 foot view on how some of these often difficult conversations can be approached.
Right. So in this book, I talk about spectral discussions. And what I mean by that is if an issue can be polarized, and many of them are, polarized, take, for example, gun control, something to which your country deals with on a daily basis. What you do is you look at the extremes of that. What should we do? Well, allow all guns everywhere, no matter what. You can drive a tank to work, you can do all that kind of stuff. The other end of the spectrum, no guns whatsoever, all that kind of thing. And then start by determining where on the spectrum the two discussants lie. Like, where are you? And then see how in fact, polarized those views are. And then try to imagine, is there any common area between those two positions? And what are those? So, start with, what is your argument? What is it that you believe? Allow me to understand that. Have each other say what their arguments are back to each other. We call it steel manning. You're probably familiar with this.
Yeah.
Rather than straw manning the other person's argument and making it a mockery, you really want to say, okay, so let me get this straight. Is this what you believe? And then you lay it on the line. Then they can do the same. Now you know where you are on that spectrum. And now you can talk about, would we be able to change our views? Is there any evidence or any information that might draw us closer together? So I'm finding that this method is becoming very helpful.
Yeah, so Peter Boghossian has described that what would cause you to change your mind if it were the case, the feasibility test to see if someone is even open to re-examining their beliefs. Now, when it comes to, just to pick something that has come up recently here in the United States, and by the way, so Christopher's Canadian, and that's why he said your country, and just so people understand the context here of the discussion, here in the United States, there's a big controversy now around statues, Confederate-era statues and statues reminiscent of slavery. And one of the critiques I had of a lot of the conversations that are happening are that the conversations in media are often only represented by extreme views, meaning you should never take a statue down, and on the other hand, take down George Washington because he owns, like, these extremes. Whereas most people probably would be able to have a more nuanced conversation like, well, listen, there was an era where everybody had slaves, and what we should look at is maybe more whether the individual is known for promoting slavery versus whether they're really, right? So that seems to be a big part of the conversation, that often the conversations are only happening in extremes.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, right? That and the media is partially to blame because they love the extremes, right? You've got a great story, you get more clicks, you get more hits, you get
Yes.
more viewers, whatever it is. We're fascinated with the confrontation, as it were. We've lost the capacity to appreciate nuance, and it looks like we're in a baby out with the bathwater kind of movement right now, where no matter what good a person has done in their life, if during those times they were involved in other types of activities which are now deemed quite reprehensible or horrific or horrible or whatever it is, then everything that person might have accomplished that was good is ignored because they were involved with these other kind of nefarious or questionable types of moral activities. And we need to have the conversation around these statues to look at them and say, what good, if any, has this person done for humanity, and what are the bad things, and use these as teachable moments. And if they are indeed offensive for whatever reasons, should we just put them in museums then, and then use them as for educational purposes to say, yes, this person did X, Y, and Z, but you know what? They also did this as well. I teach at Ryerson University. Edgerton Ryerson was responsible for the school systems that put a lot of Aboriginal kids, took them away from their parents and put them in these schools, what's called the residential school problem. But his statue is still standing at Ryerson University, and I'm wondering if it's just a matter of time before, people think, that's got to come down as well. So he did a lot of great things for education, but he also did some not so great things. The world is more complicated. If we hold our heroes, those in high esteem, too high, they have that much farther to fall when we realize nobody's perfect, and we are a nuanced, difficult species at best.
Here in the United States, we're experiencing the deadly repercussions, I don't think that's an exaggeration, of a critical thinking gap or lack when it comes to coronavirus. And this applies to understanding how masks work. This comes to, ideas like if we tested less, we'd have fewer cases. I mean, there's no shortage of sort of examples. What do you make of the way in which this is failing in the United States? Is it education? Is it culture? Is it economics? I mean, like, where do we start?
Yeah, there are so many systems involved here, right? And some of the work I'm doing in critical thinking is something I call relational systemics, which is to look at all the systems that are involved that interplay and cause people to think the way they do at a given time in history. Yeah, we can look at the education systems for sure, but you got to understand, memes can kill you. I mean, I've written about, mimetic equilibrium and the idea that when you get comfortable with a set of ideas, it doesn't matter if they run counter to reality. If ideology can outweigh reality, and in so doing, you mentioned it, weaponized ignorance. You talk about the idea that the mask has become a symbol of oppression in your country for some people, and that is absolutely bizarre for the rest of the world to look at that and think, you're missing a really important point here, and that is this is a public health issue. It's apolitical. It has nothing to do with politics. We want everybody to survive. We don't care what your politics is. We don't want you to die. We don't want you to, feel discomfort or to spread the disease any further. So, that is a horrific example of weaponizing ignorance and using it as a tool or a symbolic representation of a political movement.
So some people in my audience feel very strongly, and I've even said this before, that if critical thinking and epistemology and philosophy were a part of everybody's schooling starting probably around 7th grade, age 12, that a lot of this that we're seeing would be short-circuited and preempted altogether. But then I do get pushback from people who work in school systems that are teaching these things to some degree, saying the problem is bigger than that, and you have to understand that teachers can only do so much anyway, and a lot of it is what's going on at home and what's going on in culture and what's going on in the media. So what's the lowest hanging fruit? Where do we start to turn this around, and what could have the biggest effect most quickly?
Right. I've been lobbying governments here in Canada and have had some success with trying to get critical thinking taught first of all, at the high school system. You know very well, David, that critical thinking teaches people how to think, right? It's the tools that allow them to better understand information and then to determine, the acceptability of that information and whether or not they should act on that information. And I do very much believe if we could get critical thinking into the schools as early as possible, I believe 7 and 8 is probably the right time to start to introduce it, to get it going. I think it would be much more difficult for people to then say, I don't care what science says, my leader maintains X.
Yes.
Because it empowers people. Critical thinking isn't just something you do, it's what you live. And we have to make that a part of people's lives so that it becomes almost reflexive. It almost becomes a reflex action when information is presented in a particular way that is false to the way in which the natural world actually functions. And that's where we need to start. We need to start at those middle age grades, 7 and 8, and all the way through high school, for sure.
From the standpoint of the virus and what you've observed, what if we do a sort of analysis of fallacious thinking or fallacious assertions? What are the main fallacies that you're seeing in the context of discussions about cases, viral spread, contagion, treatment, masks, et cetera? I mean, just get, if you have a couple bullet points on that.
Right. Well, first of all, it's the misinformation and disinformation we have to stop, and that's, what was it? Twain said, "A lie can make itself around the world, halfway around the world, while the truth is putting its shoes on," or whatever. So once misinformation gets out there, we need to focus on how to combat that quickly and effectively. And to me, there's no easy solution for that. Social media has gotten to the point where influencers are being trusted more than, scientists.
Yes.
And right once we get to that level, then I think it becomes paramount that science and the influencers, if possible, the scientists and the influencers could somehow work together, right?
What's horrifying about that is some attempts were made, like, for example, Dr. Fauci did a bunch of live streams with folks like Stephen Curry, the NBA basketball player, and trying to sort of bring it. I don't know if it was too little or too late, but you've got, a political movement which is listening more to a game show host than an infectious disease doctor.
I know. I just don't know. It just feels like we're living in an alien's thought experiment. It just seems so weird what's happening, right? To see this occur and to know what the truth is. And I'm not talking about big T metaphysical truth or anything. I'm just talking about scientific probabilistic truth that is for the benefit of all humankind. And I'm at a loss with this one in terms of what's the best way to engage in having the conversation. Like, how much evidence can be provided in order to convince somebody that they really ought to wear a mask, right? That it's not a political statement. That, finally Trump wore one for the first time, I think, the other day. What was he at, Walter Reed or wherever?
Yeah.
And, they basically said, "You're wearing one." So that's good. Somebody's got to stand up to this guy. Like, I don't know why people aren't, but maybe that's just that cult of personality that he has, right?
When it comes to statistics, it's, of course, we know very much about how statistics can be shaped in order to give the impression of A or the opposite of A, and a lot of it is just understanding the mechanisms that are used. What specifically can you recommend to the audience in order to parse statistics for themselves? Like when Donald Trump says, "We're testing more than anyone," or "the death rate has to come down tenfold." Is this a mathematical understanding that people need, or is it more of a critical thinking understanding?
Both. Like, I really do think statistical and probabilistic reasoning is a part of critical thinking, and it should be taught fairly early on. And I'm actually dealing with teachers right now who are, creatively using the pandemic to teach students about statistics and probability. It's a wonderful teachable moment that they're using under such hard, conditions. It's like that, the flower emerging out of, the manure kind of thing. It's wonderful to see them taking this as a teachable moment that they can then say, "Look, as I say, this is a numbers game. This comes down to numbers, and the better numbers we have, the more accurate we can be with those numbers." Testing, tracing, tracking, knowing who has it, knowing who doesn't have it. Look, until there's a vaccine, this is what we've got. This is our defense, especially with a virus that has, such a large asymptomatic population. And that's really what we're dealing with here. And nobody really wants to address that. But the fact of the matter is, we can solve a lot of the issues if it's done intelligently and if we have the right numbers. But we have to be together on this.
In the United States, if you look at county data, you see that the growth rates of cases are significantly higher in counties that voted for Donald Trump relative to counties that voted for Hillary Clinton. But if we step back from that maybe so specifically, in your work, have there been certain groups that seem to do better when it comes to critical thinking than worse? And I'm not talking about genetically or anything like that, but through cultural and education reasons, whether it's Democrats versus Republicans or religious versus non-religious or whatever the case may be. Are there trends you've observed?
That's a great question. I mean, we have seen that those who are more fervently religious have a little bit more difficult time reconciling inconsistencies with their worldviews, but that's to be expected, right?
Mm.
My take on religion is basically, you can believe in anything you want, you just can't harm people through those beliefs or harm other species through those beliefs. So if you're so dogmatic, you've reached a point where you refuse to entertain the possibility that you could be wrong. You see the obvious danger in that. And there's, when I look at someone like Donald Trump, there is nothing more dangerous than blind ignorance, which is not even knowing you don't know. Like, that's a really dangerous epistemic state of mind to be in. And I see it continuously. And so, yeah, if a person is overly dogmatic, that's obviously going to present barriers, right? And then you have to adjust your strategy for having a conversation with that person. You have to be much more Socratic, much more gentle in your approach, because the harder you try to consider or analyze their beliefs, the more they're going to dig in and say, you're the problem, not me.
What do you think will be the long-term effect on society of the virus? I had a conversation with Brian Greene not long ago, and there's sometimes this instinct that this is really going to change things, period. And public health is going to be done differently. The way people greet each other is going to change permanently. I tend to go in the direction of things sort of return to the mean and people go back to normal, and it's very hard to get really long lasting change for humans. Where are you on that issue?
I'm hopeful, I'm cautiously optimistic. But let's face it, David, my colleagues and I have been writing to our politicians and to politicians in China for, over 2 decades, basically saying, look, there's going to be a pandemic if we don't put initiatives in place that monitor the sale of certain types of species of animals. Like it was just a ticking time bomb. It was not a matter of if, but when. And, a lot of them would come back and say, well, we caught SARS, we took care of MERS, we got H1N1, we got a vaccine for H1N1. We're doing a good job. And my colleagues and I were saying, yeah, until we get either a long incubation period or people who are asymptomatic or both, and then you're not going to be ready. And they didn't listen to that. So I'm very hopeful that in the future, we are able to develop worldwide policies for other countries in terms of how things are done. And this is not to, necessarily be, critical of other cultures for their lifestyles and whatnot. No, this is really just a world public health issue.
Yeah, these are just facts.
Just facts. If bats, and we know bats contain a lot of viruses, and they do jump to other species, which then can jump to humans, we need to take the science and we need to utilize that as best as we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Or if it does, we've got measures in place that will stop it very, very quickly and not allow this to occur. Now, that's hopeful for the future. In regards to your other questions, I think early on, after people start to get vaccinated, it's going to take a little while for people to just start, some anyhow, to handshake or to, congregate in groups or whatnot. It's going to be interesting. Is it going to make a world of germaphobes? I hope not. I want people to be germ aware. We need to be smart about pathogens, and I'm very hopeful that you're in the Boston area where they filmed Jaws. You're probably too young to remember this, but when Jaws came out, there was a huge influx of students taking marine biology, right? They were majoring in marine biology. When Indiana Jones came out, there was a huge influx of students taking archaeology. I'm hoping after this, there's a huge influx of people going into microbial ecology, which is exactly what we need. We need people to understand the interconnectedness of the very tiny pathogens to the rest of the world. It's really an arms race between us and pathogens. And this was a virus, a relatively weak virus. This was, I'm not going to say easy, but
It could
this
have
is,
been much worse.
oh my goodness, this could have been, imagine if this were like an Ebola.
Right.
Like, it would be horrific. It would be, Black Death time. It would be not a good time for this planet.
Yeah. The book is So You Think You Can Think, Tools for Having Intelligent Conversations and Getting Along. We've been speaking with the book's author, Dr. Christopher DiCarlo. So great to have you on. I appreciate your time once again.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.